All right, well, joining us on the line today is Stephen Kinzer. He's a veteran New York Times correspondent who has filed stories from more than 50 countries on 5 continents. He's also a published author. He's published many books, and he's a friend of the show. He's been on the program before talking about the history of Iran, a very interesting history that many Americans are not aware of. He's here today to talk with us about the Iran nuclear deal. Stephen, it's great to have you back on Follow the Money Weekly Radio.
Wonderful to be with you.
You know, the last time you were on the program, you opened so many eyes to many people out there who don't get the kind of history that you have learned. You have had boots on the ground in Iran. I'm sure that many of our listeners don't know anybody in Iran. They probably don't know anybody who's been to Iran. But yet they seem to have a very strong opinion about Iran, even though they don't know anybody from there, nor have they ever been there. So before we get into the Iran nuclear deal and some of the political nuances that are informing the public on it, why don't we just go back for a moment, because this is your area of expertise. You've studied this over and over again and written many different books upon America's history of regime change. Many people don't know about that 1953 coup that occurred back in Iran. Why don't we go back and visit that for a moment?
You're quite right that many people in the United States who have fallen into this anti-Iran mode really know nothing about Iran. I think Iran is probably the world's most misunderstood country. It's been cut off from the West for decades, and during that period, much of the world press, with limited access to Iran, has joined to demonize Iran. So anybody in the United States or Europe who believes much of what's been in the press and much of what political leaders have been saying over the last 35 years would be reasonably led to believe that Iran must be one of the world's nastiest places. One reason we are led to believe this is that we catalog all the terrible things Iran has done to us. It starts with the hostage crisis more than 35 years ago. It goes through various allegations of Iran's involvement in terrorism and even its involvement in the war. But what we don't see is how the world looks to Iranians. So for us, U.S. Iran relations effectively begin and end with the hostage crisis. But what we don't understand is that from the Iranian point of view, that was just a little blip on the horizon. What really shaped U.S. Iran relations was a much bigger episode that happened in 1953. Iran had been on the way to democracy for almost half a century and had finally elected a parliament and a nationalist prime minister who was widely popular. But because that new elected government was democratic and had to respond to the wishes of the Iranian people, it proceeded with the central project that all Iranians were devoted to, and that was to try to regain control of Iran's oil resources. The entire oil industry of Iran was owned by one big British company, which in turn was owned by the British government. So all of the prosperity of Britain during the 1920s and 30s and 40s came from Iranian oil. All the factories in Britain were running on oil from Iran, and all the trucks and buses were running on Iranian oil. The Royal Navy, which projected British power all over the world, was running 100% on oil from Iran. So, meanwhile, Iranians were living in some of the worst conditions and the most miserable poverty of any people in the world. They tried to reclaim their ownership of their own oil. That alarmed the British and the Americans. We staged a coup in 1953. We not only overthrew the prime minister of Iran, but we destroyed Iranian democracy, and it's never returned. So Iranians also have grievances, and I think that's something we should bear in mind as we look at this new agreement. These are two countries, the United States and Iran, that have done each other grievous harm. It's difficult for both of us to get over that, and I think it's important for Americans to realize that our grievances and our pain are not the only grievances and the only pain in this relationship.
Yeah, very good overview. And by the way, I want to mention that folks who are unaware of that history can read your excellent book that was put out back in 2003. It's called All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. Now, let's move on to this Iran deal, because it's been making a lot of news, of course, this year. Now we are in the week that Congress is debating it. There's been all kinds of posturing on both sides of the aisle. Of course, it appears that President Obama has the votes needed to secure the deal. But let's talk about the actual deal itself. You, as someone who has studied Iran for some time, you knowing the underlying issues that are facing both countries, what's your take on this deal?
I think it's the greatest strategic breakthrough for the United States since we reversed our policy toward China more than 40 years ago. It decisively advances American security interests in the Middle East. It breaks us out of a strategic straitjacket that we've been in for decades. We've only been able to talk to certain people. We've refused to talk to certain others. Meanwhile, the world has changed. So the most important aspects of this new deal are strategic. And the key strategic advance is that this deal more or less guarantees that Iran is never going to become a nuclear power. So that profoundly alters all security calculations in the Middle East. So it's also good for Iran because the only reason any country would have to attack Iran would be that it was developing a nuclear weapon. So that takes away this possibility. But beyond that, by tearing down a barrier to engagement, this agreement gives the United States and other outside powers a framework within which they can talk to Iran. This channel is going to contribute to a more peaceful and stable Middle East. If you look at a map of the Middle East, one thing jumps out at you, and that is Iran is the big country right in the middle. You are not going to have a stable region if the big country right in the middle is frozen out of discussions and demonized and pushed into a corner and sanctioned and punished. We have to bring Iran out of its isolation, and that in turn gives Iran motives to participate more responsibly in the region. Once it benefits from stability, it will be able to use its deep contacts to promote stability. Now, some of the critics of the deal are saying this is going to empower Iran. It's going to give Iran more authority. And that's true. But look at whether that is actually a bad idea. Iran has huge influence, particularly in Shiite communities in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and it can use its influence to calm some of those communities which are involved in strife. Now, certainly in the past, some of Iran's involvement with those factions has been destabilizing. But once Iran is brought into the international system, we'll find out that it has contacts and pressure points that no one else has. So we're broadening our strategic options, and that's always a good thing.
Let's talk about the follow the money aspect of this because, of course, the name of this program is Follow the Money, and we want to pay close attention to not just the chattering voices that are going on in Washington and abroad, but mainly what's really underpinning this agreement. And one of the things that I noticed is that many of the detractors and the critics in the region, especially Saudi Arabia and Israel even, seem to be very concerned about the financial gain that Iran is going to be receiving from this, pointing to the fact that the balance of power may be shifting. What are some of the things that Americans aren't aware of? I mean, we obviously think of the Shiite and Sunni tensions that exist. Certainly that's playing part of the demonization that we see in the press. What is Saudi Arabia mostly concerned about? Are they really concerned about getting bombed by Iran?
Not at all. There's a tremendous over-exaggeration of Iranian military power. We've portrayed it as a kind of a military juggernaut, but in fact, its rivals are far better armed and equipped. Saudi Arabia spends 5 times as much on its military as Iran does. Saudi Arabia has the world's most modern weapon systems, most of them bought from the United States. Iran has primitive weapons. Many of them go back to the Shah's period. They've been frozen out of the international arms market for decades. So there is no real danger of Iran launching an attack on anybody. But as you point out, following the money is always valuable in international affairs as well as in other ways. I believe it's one of the hidden reasons why this accord came about. There are powerful interests in the United States that see tremendous profits to be made in Iran. Bear in mind, this is the world's only remaining untapped big consumer market. You've got almost 80 million people. They're highly educated. They are focused on the West. They love gadgets. They're consumer-oriented. And best of all, since Iran has so much oil and gas, Iran has lots of money to pay for whatever it wants. So what does it want? Well, the biggest investment that's going to be made in Iran in the coming years is going to be in oil infrastructure. That country needs something like $150 billion in investment to rebuild all its refineries, all its oil facilities, all its pipeline network. And it happens that American companies are very good at that. The second big, huge investment that Iran needs is aviation. They've been frozen out of the civil aviation market, and I was just in Iran a couple of months ago, and one thing I noticed is that at every airport, there's a plane parked at the end of the runway or in some hangar which is falling apart, and I see that's the plane that they're cannibalizing to get spare parts for their other planes. Iran Air needs something like 400 passenger aircraft, and Iran needs a whole air force. This is a spectacular opportunity for Boeing and Airbus. It will make them money for decades to come. That's the reason that there's been a quiet push outside of public eye from these big corporations to get this deal done. If the other countries involved that are negotiating with Iran go ahead without the United States, they're going to get all the profits. So I think there's a strong feeling in the American business community that they want to get a piece of the world's last big remaining consumer market, and that's going to be a major effect of this agreement.
You are listening to the voice of Stephen Kinzer. He is a published author, a journalist, an academic. He has filed stories for the New York Times and other well-known newspapers from 50 different countries on 5 continents. Stephen, you just mentioned that you were in Iran just a couple of months ago. What's the general tone there from the success of this deal?
Well, I was there after the first initial deal had been signed, but before the final deal had been signed. And I chose to go, especially at that time, because I wanted to answer the question that you've just asked me. What are Iranians feeling? First of all, I observed something that I've seen in every visit I've ever made to Iran, and this is something that I think will probably surprise many Americans. There is no more pro-American population in the world than Iran. Iranians are besotted with the United States. They love Americans. They have an exaggerated view of how wonderful we are. When you walk down the street and stop people, as I did repeatedly in Iran, and say, I'm American, they shriek. I've had them jump up and down. They call all their friends over. They try to take selfies so they can show their friends that they've met with a person who's a citizen of a great blessed nation. This pro-American sentiment in Iran is a hugely valuable strategic asset for us. Now, I spoke to a lot of Iranians about future trading partners and how they feel about other countries in the world. And often I got this answer. We remember how badly the British and the Russians treated us in the past. The French didn't treat us well. We're uncomfortable with China. We're uncomfortable with Israel. We really feel good about the United States. And I believe that actually some Iranian hardliners are worried about this. They realize that this agreement is going to liberate a certain amount of this pro-American sentiment. And it's going to be a little bit destabilizing for the Iranian political system, which I think is good. So we are now on the brink of a deal and a new relationship that will take advantage of this hugely positive feeling towards the United States that is so widespread in Iran.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that out because here in the United States, it's the far right, hardline right, that is strongly opposed to this deal. And in Iran, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is also the hard right wing of the government that is also opposing this deal because of some of the fears that you just brought up. And so
you're absolutely right. There's this bizarre coincidence. There's this bizarre communion of interests between some Republicans in Washington and the mullahs and the hardliners in Iran. They are deeply invested in the paradigm of hostility. It's serves many interests. Countries often like to have enemies, and it's great to feel like there's a demon out there so that you can unify your country and whip people up into emotion. In Iran, groups like the Revolutionary Guard, which is probably the most repressive organ there, are worried about this deal. And I'll tell you one reason. As we have been imposing harsher and harsher sanctions on Iran, Iranians have still been able to buy anything they want. They have to pay more for it, but you can buy everything. You can buy the Apple phone on the street in Tehran, a legitimate one, not a knockoff. Anything you want, you can order, and those sanctions busters are bringing these goods illegally across the Persian Gulf every day. Who are sanctions busters? It's the Revolutionary Guard. They are getting rich. So in a sense, our sanctions are empowering and enriching the most brutally repressive organ in Iran, the Revolutionary Guard. Now, if the sanctions are lifted, you won't need sanctions busters anymore. That's going to reduce the reduce the Revolutionary Guard's income and power. So groups like that are worried about it. Reconciliation requires rethinking on both sides, and there are powerful forces that prevent many people from rethinking the world. We look at the world, we form certain conclusions, and we like to hold on to those conclusions. What we're doing with this Iran agreement is trying to break that paradigm and ask people on both sides to rethink this relationship. That's often difficult, and I think that's causing trouble both in Washington and Tehran.
My guest today is Stephen Kinzer. He is the author of many books covering the Middle East and geopolitics. In our final moments here, Stephen, I want to bring up the topic of Israel. Of course, that's a very touchy subject here in America because they are a tremendous ally in the region. They have expressed tremendous grievance over this particular deal because Iran obviously has made major threats publicly. When I refer to Iran, by the way, we're referring to the hardline government that has made threats against the Israeli state over the years. And so obviously Israel is focusing upon those statements and is asking the United States, why are you supporting this regime and trying to broker a deal with them? But in that context, we brought up Saudi Arabia earlier, and perhaps you can help us understand this, because in Saudi Arabia, you have the same Sharia law. In fact, when we go back to 1948 and we see who invaded Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, we see that it was Saudi Arabia, not Iran. In the 1967 war, we see Saudi Arabia's fingerprints on the handgun as they were invading Israel. Iran had nothing to do with that war. And nevertheless, it's in a strange way, Israel fears Iran, but seems totally cozy with the Saudis, who, as you mentioned, have, I guess, the third largest military in the world and now want nuclear weapons. So what gives here? What's the difference between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Is it all purely economics? That sounds so jaded.
I don't think so. I think part of it has to do with the sense in Israel that there is a movement designed to wipe Israel away, and I think you can understand where that comes from. The fact is, however, as you point out, Iran has not invaded another country for hundreds of years, unlike Israel and Saudi Arabia, which have also always often carried out international invasions. Israelis have been victimized by the demonization of Iran in the press even more than we have. But let me just make 2 points. First of all, Persians and Jews have a long relationship. It goes all the way back to the Bible. I mean, Cyrus, the first great king of the Persians, was the one who liberated the Jews from their Babylonian captivity. It's in the Bible. Even more recently, when the Shah was in power, Israel and Iran had good relations. And I do feel that these two countries are not only born to be hostile, but in the long run, they'll see that their interests coincide. Israel's interests in the long run are closer to those of Iran than they are to those of Saudi Arabia, although that is not what they see now. So I think the Israeli fears are much misplaced. Having said that, however, let me make one other observation. All of Israel's arguments against the nuclear accord, in my view, are either mistaken or tendentious or exaggerated, except for one. And that's the argument that words matter. So even if Iran behaves completely impeccably and observes this agreement completely, Israelis will have a reason for unease. As long as Iran is run by a government which has questioned Israel's right to exist and questioned the Holocaust. So the new president has denounced what he calls the hate rhetoric of his predecessor. He sent a nice tweet at Rosh Hashanah, but that's not enough. Jewish history gives Israelis the right to fear the worst from a powerful neighbor that denies their right to exist. So Iran also now has some fence mending to do. I'd like to see Iran respond to this agreement by reaching out to Saudi Arabia and reaching out to Israel. I think that's the way that we can begin to move ahead on this agreement from just affecting the nuclear issue to trying to extend it in ways that will help stabilize the region and calm the fears of some of Israel's neighbors. Calm the fears of some of Iran's neighbors. And I think Israel's among them. I think some of their fears are justified, but most are wildly exaggerated.
One final question, Stephen, and let's go back to Iran for this final question, and that is, you having had boots on the ground, you've been there, you've walked around, you've talked to the people numerous times, and you're also very aware of the Iranian government throughout history. How sustainable do you believe that the current regime is, given the pro-America stance that continues in the overall Iranian population?
I don't see any radical change coming. I asked people about this when I was in Iran a few months ago. Will this accord have an immediate political effect? Will it change your political system? And almost everybody told me no, it's not going to. But let me put that in an Iranian context. Iranians do not want radical change. Ultimately, they want a different kind of government, but they have learned such a bitter lesson about revolution. When they overthrew the Shah, they agreed among themselves, although these factions hated each other, that we don't know what comes after the Shah, but whatever it is, it has to be better. So what happened? They got something worse. Iranians learned a painful lesson. They don't want revolution anymore. Since that's happened to them, they've watched what happened in Syria. Syrians protested against their government, and then when they were repressed, they rose up in arms. Iranians did something different. In 2009, they rose up by the millions to protest a fraudulent election. They were beaten also by the Revolutionary Guards. But they responded differently. They went home. They said, it's not worth it. Let's not tear the country apart. We didn't achieve our result. We're going to wait. Time will pass. We've been around as a country for 25 centuries. We can afford to wait. So Iranians not only are not looking forward to an immediate change in government, they don't want that. They don't like their regime. But what they fear even more is radical change, because they have had the bitter experience of where that leads. So they have a great lesson to teach the rest of the Middle East. It's better to ride the currents of history rather than try to force them and come up with results that can lead to terrible violence.
My guest today has been Stephen Kinzer. He is a published author, a journalist, an academic, and he's written several books over the years. In our final moments here, Stephen, if you don't mind sharing with our folks how they can get a hold of you or get a hold of your books, learn more about you.
Sure. I have a website. It's Stephen Kinzer, so my name is spelled with a PH, Stephen, and it's Kinzer, KINZER.com. Or go on to the Amazon website, and you'll see all my books out there. I've got a couple of books about Iran and other books about the region. I've got a book called Overthrow that describes the history of American overthrows of foreign governments over the last century. So if you're looking for a different view of American history and collection of untold stories about what we've done in the world, I hope you'll check out some of the work that I've done, and look forward to elaborating on these themes the next time I'm on your show.
I will add an exclamation point to your book, Overthrow. I finished that a few years ago. Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. I learned so much from that book. I really do appreciate your time today, Stephen. Really do appreciate your insights, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
I look forward to it myself. Thanks.